presentation?
One.
Only one. And then we are finished with this switching projector.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then
Then we're waiting for the movie.
that next panel, we just do everything from up there. Yeah. And the man will advance his own slides.
Okay, okay.
And I'm here to do that because I got slugs on my fingers and I've been inside
first?
all day.
But the speaker would prefer to advance
Yeah,
his own
yeah, yeah,
slides.
yeah. But I need to once it's just to pull it up. Yeah.
Daljinski.
Kod speakera.
Ja nek stoji tu ovdje, muđa.
Dala sam ja. Daljinski.
Okej,
gospodin.
nego
A
daljinski,
izdalje,
da-
ono
da.
izdaleka. Je, je.
Aha, on je već ovdje na
A
ovom.
on ima. A da.
Samo.
Da, evo.
Je to tamo?
Ali nije, samo nije.
That's it. It's ready to go. But we don't want that
But
on the
he's not
screen
gonna
now.
be the first
Da,
one.
nemoj
No,
sada,
ne
nemoj
još,
sada,
ne
nego
još.
hoću da ti kažem, nemoj ga u džepu nositi.
Just to be ready.
Ja, ostavi ga negdje ovdje da možemo.
He will ask for it when he's ready. Okay. Yes.
When he's ready, someone will come. Quick presentation goes up. Is that okay?
So
It's easier than the remote.
yeah, okay. So what does he do to make it to put that up on there?
Start from the beginning.
Okay.
I'll do that.
Okay, you can do that.
I'll do
There,
that.
now you're presenting the system. Wonderful work. Thank you.
Sure, because the initial plan was to have me inside for all the panels. And then they said, no, because, yeah, but there was no need. And then even you said you would be doing the first two,
yeah.
and I did the third one, and I was doing all the other stuff. And it's like,
Actually,
when
they
are
told me.
you supposed to do?
It's supposed to be here.
Okay.
Yep. So just hit first slide to make it go, right?
Yeah, I did.
Just
From the beginning. Okay.
beginning
Yep. Ernesto's handling it. She's actually an expert
for slides.
for slides.
Burns, now I will be more.
Exactly. She'll be teaching a course.
Učim se, sve što računam učim.
Dobro, vi naš govori, ne znam.
Ja sam iz Sarajeva, ja već radim s njima, pa
Sve
jedna
spremno.
jedina.
Jedna.
I razriješim.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're starting the next panel, 7, discussion on historical legacy. Thank you very much for taking your seats. That was a block.
Good job.
You can start
So, a warm welcome to all of you. First of all, thank you for staying after this very long day. It's always very tough to have the last substantive panel of the day. We hope, nevertheless, that the theme of the panel will be interesting enough with a few coffees to keep you awake. So the theme of this panel is to engage with historical legacy. And this panel builds on, I think, very nicely on the discussion on non-judicial legacy that we had yesterday. The tribunal has left a tremendous record in terms of resources, in terms of documentary evidence, in terms of judgments and trials that it has completed. There's a huge record of archives. But the difficult question is to answer, how do we connect the legacy of the courtroom to the broader historical legacy? That's, of course, an old debate. Hannah Arendt in the 1960s expressed skepticism as to whether trials are actually able and should engage with a historical record, and she said trials should be really focused on establishing guilt or innocence of the person rather than historical inquiry. In the 1990s, the focus might have shifted slightly. If we read UN reports, there's a greater degree of optimism that the record produced by courts and tribunals can actually be useful for historical purposes. Today, I think there's a sense of modesty, and there are different positions in relation to the relationship between criminal justice and historical record. We have some voices who argue that the criminal trial produces records, but they are only a useful byproduct for historical purposes. So in other words, establishing a historical record should not be the primary purpose of international criminal proceedings, but is at best a secondary effect. And we might have other mechanisms like truth and reconciliation commissions who might be better equipped for purposes of historical clarification. There's a second view which argues that actually the legal testing of evidence in court and the environment of the courtroom can actually make a tremendous contribution. So the question is not whether criminal proceedings contribute to history, but the question is rather how do they contribute to history. And I think this is a little bit the perspective that this panel will engage with. We've heard some hard questions being posed in the previous panels. Marko Milanovic telling us about the parallel realities that have emerged as part of the proceedings. And he posed the hard question, how can a historical record actually be created? And does it require a shared discursive space before we can actually create and speak about of historical record? Janine Clark, in her presentation, has, I think, made a very interesting distinction by forcing us to look beyond fact. Our traditional assumption is that facts contribute to historical clarification. But she made the point, don't we have to look beyond facts if we look about legacy and record? Finally, Michelle Jarvis said, only 30% of the witnesses who testified were female witnesses. What, again, does this mean for our inquiry in relation to historical legacy? What type of history is then portrayed through that type of testimony? I think those are the questions that really need to be answered. Finally, I think there's some agreement that the judgment alone does not serve as a source of historical clarification, but we might need to look beyond the judgment itself if we look at historical record. And we see it when we observe trials. The moments of intensity of how proceedings are actually captured and portrayed really differ. Often there are only single moments in the trials which get a lot of attention. For instance, the presentation of a specific video, the presentation of a particular witness who testifies. So there seems to be a singular perception of proceedings in relation to the public, which contrasts with a broader record that actually is only revealed through years of proceedings. So the real question is, how can proceedings actually establish a full record? How can we connect these different pieces through different cases into a broader historical narrative? So this panel is really, I think, a wonderful opportunity to engage with these difficult set of questions. And the first presentation is given by Professor Harmen van der Wild from the University of Amsterdam, and he will speak to the general relationship between law and history. The second presentation will be given by Thijs Bouknecht from the Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the Netherlands. And Thijs argues that we need to look beyond the trial and that we need to really look at the record and look at other reports and observations outside the legal realm in order to understand the contribution to historical record. The third presentation will be given by Eva Vukovic, who's a former journalist, and she's currently doing a PhD at Utrecht University, and she will particularly address how ICTY records and databases are useful beyond the courtroom. And finally, Andy Ayadine Atchison examines some of the difficult questions relating to testimony and evidence, how they can serve as a source of historical record. And he argues that such sources need to be handled with a certain degree of care. So I think we really can look forward to an exciting panel, and I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Harmen van der Wild.
Thank you, Karsten, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conference, so rich and rewarding. The relationship between law and history is a complex one and basically works both ways. On the one hand, international criminal courts and tribunals deal with system criminality. Atrocities are committed on a large scale, often with involvement or condoned by the state. These crimes are mostly committed in the context of an intense struggle for political or economic power. The systematic nature of these crimes is epitomized by the contextual elements which are part of their definition. The adjudication of these crimes requires an understanding of the social and political causes, and historians can provide these insights. For want of a better term, I call this the input side. On the other hand, criminal trials produce narratives which may be highly interesting material for historians to investigate and discover what has really happened. And I call this, oh, gee.
It's okay, there's just a hole in the floor.
Hole in the floor. Oh.
Fine.
One of those traps.
Just a second. Can you just...
Yeah.
It's okay, just the chair saying.
Yeah. Is it all right?
Yeah, it's fine. Sorry
Yeah?
to interrupt.
No problem. I'll give you the favor. So on the other hand, criminal trials produce narratives which may be highly interesting material for historians to investigate and discover what has really happened. And this is the output side. So in my presentation, I will address both the input and the output. But before doing this, I will briefly reflect on the question why the relationship between law and history is not a marriage of made in heaven. It is rather a marriage of convenience. Now, Karsten, you already hijacked Hannah Arendt, so I will skip that. But we all know that Hannah Arendt put focus on the individual, and she loathed the idea that we should use trials for historical purposes. But should Hannah Arendt have the final word, as Marty Koskenniemi has asked rhetorically? Richard Wilson has pondered on this question and has pointed at the epistemological and methodological differences between history and law that shed light on their complex relationship. And his line of argumentation can be summarized as follows. The objectives and means of law and history are diametrically opposed. To some extent, they are each other's mirror image. Compared to history, law's main goal is simultaneously more modest and more ambitious. During the trial, the focus is on the individual, his individual criminal responsibility. Has this man or woman committed the crime for which she has been charged? And that is the modest part. However, his or her guilt must be assessed beyond a reasonable doubt. There's no room for hesitation, and that's, of course, the ambitious part. Historians aim to draw the broader picture. They are interested in macro structures, the interaction between economic, political, social, and cultural developments. By contrast, historians allow for more open, malleable truths and accept that they may and will be adapted. Obviously, the methods of truth-finding are geared to these disparate objectives. In adversarial trials, rigid cross-examinations serve to reveal the objective truth, and in inquisitorial procedures, the professional judge is attempting to accomplish the same. Trials aim at closure, the settlement of the matter once and for all. The principle of non bis in idem, double jeopardy, reflects that idea. You should not reopen the case because it has been concluded. And this meticulous reconstruction of what actually happened make that criminal trials are often tedious, they're boring, and are not likely to create much excitement amongst the population. Marty Koskenniemi, he has He has written this famous article in defense of show trials. Shouldn't they be made a bit more exciting in order to make appeal and to understand what has happened? In history, the discursive method prevails. History writing never ends. New insights are discussed and integrated, often leading to entirely new perspectives that obviously reflect the change in political and cultural preferences of the writer. Now, how can the bits and pieces of rigid truths produced by criminal trials fit the flexible and ever-changing mold of historiography? It seems a mission impossible. Although I acknowledge all these problems, I'm still of the opinion that law and history are stuck with each other. The nature of international crimes is the linchpin between the two. As we all know, international crimes differ from ordinary crimes in that they require proof of contextual elements. International crimes are part and parcel of system criminality. So genocide, as we know, is defined by the perpetrator's specific intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. And although it's not an element of the crime, it presupposes a policy to embark on such a vicious course. The Rome Statute stipulates that a crime against humanity is part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any population, and Article 7 of the Rome Statute explains that such an attack means a course of conduct involving the multiple commission of acts pursuant to or in furtherance of a state or organizational policy to commit such an attack. In the Kunalac case, the Appeals Chamber has famously denied that such organizational policy is a requisite element of the crime. It is perhaps the most famous footnote, footnote 114, in the judgment of the Appeals Chamber. But we can assume that this opinion has been superseded by later developments in international criminal law. My colleague, William Schabas, is, with his usual panache, very critical about this particular finding. War crimes are arguably the least emblematic form of system criminality, as they can be committed in relative isolation from any policy. However, they require a nexus with an armed conflict, so at the very least the existence of such an armed conflict must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. It must be assessed whether this armed conflict is of an international or non-international character, because both IHL and international criminal law make a distinction in a normative regime governing the crimes. Moreover, Article 8 of the Rome Statute directs the focus of the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction to those war crimes that are committed as part of a plan or policy or as a part of a large-scale commission of such crimes. The modes of responsibility in international criminal law are accommodated to the nature of system criminality. The famous or infamous, just the perspective that you take, joint criminal enterprise doctrine entails a multitude of perpetrators acting together to accomplish a common criminal purpose, and each making a contribution to that objective, corresponding with his or her position within the wider organization. The concept has been widely used to sustain criminal responsibility of political leaders which are far removed from the crime scene. For instance, in the Krajnik case, in which the trial chamber concluded that the accused general policy of ethnic cleansing had contributed to the shelling of this beautiful city. In other cases, policy and context have been equally relevant. In the Perisic case, for example, the appeals chamber acquitted the accused from aiding and abetting war crimes, holding that his military assistance to Bosnian Serbian and Bosnian Croat militias was not specifically directed to facilitate the commission of those crimes. It rather served to support their general war effort. How could the chamber come to that conclusion without a thorough assessment of Perisic's general war policy in the first place? And how is it possible for judges, being lay people in politics and history, to make such an assessment at all, one is inclined to ask? I'll give you another example, that is of Hadzi Hazanovic, a name that is always very difficult for my students to pronounce, Hadzi Hazanovic, but he was a high-ranking Bosnian general who stood trial on account of having been responsible on the basis of command responsibility. Now, Hadži Hasanović was a man with a rather unblemished reputation, and his troops were flooded by Mujahideen warriors, which we wanted to help the Bosnian cause. And the point was that he, of course, couldn't understand them properly. Moreover, he was appointed after these crimes had been committed, so that was a real puzzle, a real difficult issue for the ISTY to decide whether one could incur responsibility for crimes that had been committed prior to his assuming control. Now, Mr. Brummett, this morning, he has already discussed this distinction between regular armies in which there is a clear chain of command and irregular groups in which it's more convoluted, more difficult. So in order to assess to what extent Mr. The suspect would incur responsibility on the basis of superior responsibility, one has to understand something of the chain of command in those entities. And here the historians rush in the courtroom. They have frequently been invited by the trial chambers of the ISTY, the ISTR, International Criminal Court, Special Court of Sierra Leone, to do so, and they have provided invaluable expert testimony. Trial chambers have not relied on one source, but have tested accounts of historians against each other. And this is obviously a highly delicate affair because they lack the expertise to decide which of them best represents the objective truth. So this is one side of the symbiosis. The historians assist the courts. What about the other side of the equation? Are trial records valuable historical sources that deserve further exploration by historians? I must admit that I have become cautious after having read the highly interesting PhD thesis of my co-panelist Thijs Bouwknecht, which I have the pleasure to assess, but I already told him that he need not worry because it's of good quality. I will limit myself to making a couple of comments, being confident that Thijs will elaborate on them in a more sophisticated way than I am able to do so. First of all, we must realize that criminal trials are highly selective. They focus on the individual responsibility of a handful of perpetrators and produce narratives that cannot easily be assembled to a broader historical truth of macro political and social events. Secondly, facts are filtered through the criminal trial that deliberately seeks a digital outcome. The accused is guilty or not guilty, which does not leave much room for the shades of grey with which historical research is littered. Thirdly, the question to what extent international criminal trials may provide durable macro truths that could withstand the test of scrutiny may depend on the nature of the evidence. Bouwknecht makes the plausible claim that trials covering mass atrocities in sub-Saharan Africa may be problematic in this respect because they make use of the testimony of eyewitnesses, which is notoriously unreliable, not because they are not honest people, but due to the fallibility of human perception. So tribunals that can fall back and take stock of documentary evidence, the infamous paper trial, like the Nuremberg Tribunal and the ISTY, are in a more advantageous position in this respect. And finally, we should not forget that the trial record does not cast the truth in stone. Historians will interpret the outcomes according to their own preferences. In short, the trial will not stop the fluidity of historiography. Bearing all these caveats in mind, it is my opinion that trial records can make a valuable contribution to historical truth-finding, precisely because international criminal courts and tribunals cannot evade a broader historical context. one should only be careful not to overestimate its relevance. I would like to end my brief presentation on the topic with an observation of the function of history in international criminal trials that, in my opinion, has not deserved sufficient attention. Judgments of international criminal tribunals often start with a historical survey. I do not think that this primarily serves as a prelude to a discussion of the contextual elements, but rather as a kind of didactic message. One could disparagingly qualify this as window dressing, or one could consider this as a rather pompous assertion of its own historical task, but I'm inclined to see it just the other way around, as a token of modesty that the court is operating in a wider historical context and wishes to pay due attention to that particular context. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Harman. I think you made the very valuable point that the relationship is indeed a dialectic relationship, so historians contribute to international criminal proceedings, and international criminal proceedings may in some respects also contribute to historical record. You already alluded to the distinction between different categories of evidence, and you even made a recommendation about how trials might actually engage even more effectively with history. So I think you made a perfect transition to Thijs, who will now follow up on some of these points.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks for the organizers for the kind invitation to speak at this really interesting conference, and I've been really enjoying myself so far. Also, thanks to Karsten for really laying out the groundwork of the discussion and the topics we're talking about. Also to Harman for his nice compliment on my PhD, and I think also he did a really nice job in already summarizing the main points of that. Having said that, I'm going to try to speak from the perspective of the contemporary historian. So that means I do not only look at the distant past, but also at the very recent past, including the trials themselves. And like Eva, who was a journalist for many years, I've been so as well. So for the past 14 years, I have observed most of the trials I have been researching. And as Harman has already said, most of those trials in my research were related to Sub-Saharan Africa. So it was mainly dealing with the ICTR, Special Court for Sierra Leone, and also the recent cases at the ICC. So what I'm going to say today is mostly informed by those cases and those experience, my experience also in researching the trial records and the archives of those courts. But I think they can also attain to what is the case at the ICTY and the archives at the ICTY and the trial records. Which are both different things, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Obviously, also the ICTY is a little bit atypical in terms of the rest of the tribunals, because it's very much a documentary tribunal. So it deals with a lot of documentary evidence, different than, for instance, the cases in Rwanda or Sierra Leone or even Congo, or East Timor, one tribunal we haven't been speaking about so far. So what I would wish to do is to organize my talk a little bit in two topics. So first I want to speak a little bit about why historians are interested in international criminal justice, and also what their relationship to international criminal justice is. And also I want to make a point that we should also be a little bit modest as historians and not be too impatient. Because I think many of us amongst the historians are very impatient for the trial record and the archives to just become available to us. Second of all, I would like to speak about the trial record and the archive itself and talk a little bit about the potentials, but also the challenges of using them as historical sources. So we'll start with some thoughts on the strong relationship between the historian and international criminal justice. And I think Harman van der Wild has already alluded to some of the critical elements in that debate and also in the literature. So I'd like to add just some thoughts just for matters of organization. And I would like to start by saying that judges and historians indeed share many similarities. So basically, they're both in search of the truth and facts about the past. And I think that's very important to remember. But there are crucial differences between the two, between the judge and between the historian. And this is in the way they look at the past, but also the questions they ask to the past, and also what they do with it. And so I've organized it in some spheres where these differences come about most. So I think first is the operational space. Judges and tribunals, of course, are very restricted by the mandates they're giving. They can only deal with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide within a specific time frame and within a specific locality. Historians are not restrained to that. So, for instance, my institute, the NIOD, wrote a big report on Srebrenica, which starts already in the 13th century. I mean, that's much bigger scope in terms of time. Obviously, there's also a difference in the focus. So trials and judges, they deal with individual criminal responsibility. And historians, and Harman has already said it, we deal with the past at large. This means also the good things. So we don't only deal with the bad things in history. And I think that's important to also think about. Obviously, there is also matters of the macro-historical facts which interest the historian. I think another important difference is the goal between the judge and the historian. The judge judges and punishes and metes out punishment, while historians seek to explain and perhaps also understand the past. For instance, I think motive in law is rather irrelevant, while for the historian, it's one of the key drivers in writing. We want to understand why these things have happened. I think that's important to bear in mind. Also, the sources are different. So judges have to rely on the evidence which is presented to them by different parties. They have no choice. As an historian, we have a free range of choice amongst our sources. We can just go out and find whatever is relevant or what we find is relevant. I think that's also a crucial difference. Obviously, there is also differences in the truth regime. Judges have to adjudicate historical facts or historical discourses beyond any reasonable doubt. That's a very high threshold. And historians, we can deal with the balance of probabilities. We can even speculate and move onwards to a more nuanced story as we go further. Important is also the conclusions. The conclusion of a trial is rather black and white. It's either guilty or it's not guilty. And as Harman has already said, there's no room for the gray zones or for nuance. There may be some exceptions. I remember that the judge in the Ngojolo trial said that if somebody's not guilty, does not mean he's innocent. So there's a little bit of room for entry into the gray zone. Obviously, there's also differences in their findings. So the findings of judges are permanent. They end with the second instance verdicts. In history, revision is the rule, and debate is the rule. Our products are actually never final, which also is an important difference. Last of all, the difference is in the terms of writing. So judges have a very legalistic way of writing. They use legalese. Somebody used the term yesterday, and I think that's a very good description of how judgments are written. Historians use basically a style of storytelling. We tell a story which perhaps is accessible or more accessible to people who are not familiar with the legal jargon. I think that's also important. So overall, historians have much more liberties than judges do. So doing justice and also writing history are very different, even if the topic of the study is the same. But the two should thus not be confused. And I think it's crucial to our understanding, especially when we deal with histories of mass violence, is that understanding these differences also makes us understand why historians, and they have done so, may come to different conclusions than judges and tribunals. So moving to why historians are interested in international criminal justice, and I think I have to speed up a little bit. I've organized this in two matters. So first of all, it's the subject matter, and the secondary is the evidence. Obviously, international criminal tribunals deal with facts from the past, like historians. crimes were committed in the past. But international criminal tribunals also deal with history. So they deal with crimes which took place in a larger historical context of events of greater historical significance. International criminal tribunals also deal with historical sources, so documents from the past, but they also hear evidence about the past. And those are narratives, and I think Eva will talk about the narratives. So history or events from the past is both background, but also forefront in international criminal justice. So it's historical wrongs that spark justice initiatives, but also they invoke history again, historical sources, and also historical testimony. And the historian is not only interested in the past itself, as it happens, but also in the dealing with the past by non-historians. And this is one of the key reasons why I think that historians are interested in the way that the judicial sphere and international criminal tribunals deal with the past, because we have to know how they've done it if we want to assess the archive and the trial records. Now, moving to the historical evidence. Historians are very much interested in the way tribunals can collect and produce historical evidence which is unavailable to us. Bob Britt this morning has already told how he can search and seize documents. Historians cannot do that, so we're actually very grateful that, criminal institutions can do this. Also, they have the means to conduct forensic investigations, exhume mass grave, identify victims through DNA, which we heard this morning, and even use recorded phone conversations. Tribunals may also hear directly from witnesses, from victims and accused, under oath. And the oath, of course, we cannot use as historians. Also, tribunal can summon witnesses and a variety of experts from different disciplines to which historians may actually not have access to. So, in the end, tribunals have the means and the resources to collect, translate, and store huge amounts of historically relevant sources. Historians can only dream of collecting. So I think that's very, very important. So I would jump the discussion on whether tribunals can or write history. I think I would just summarize it by saying that tribunals at least reduce the amount of impermissible lies about the past. And I think also what they do is that they bring to the fore previously unknown facts. And I think that's already really, really hugely important. For instance, the ICTR, after many years, has established that the genocide has occurred, which now is an historical fact beyond legal dispute. And I think that's a very, very important finding, which is also an historical finding. It may be a small finding in terms of the wording, but the finding itself is important. Now let me talk about the archive and the trial records. And not only do historians have the liberty to investigate the past, but they can also use the information collected by international criminal tribunals. Of course, that's an advantage. And their legacy, on the other hand, also becomes an important part of the historiography of the conflicts the tribunals deal with. So what do they leave behind? And I think yesterday's side event on archives and the trial record was already very clear about it and talked to that to a large extent. So I would just wish to summarize here as follows. So the archive is the full documentary legacy of the tribunals, the totality of documentary, physical, and audiovisual leftovers of the tribunals. It also includes perhaps the archive we're not so much interested in, and those are the archives of the Human Resources Department, for instance. The trial record is only part of the archive, and it includes those documents and audiovisual material that have been used in the trial, and also it includes those documents produced in the trial. So the archive is much bigger than just the trial record, and I think that's important to understand. Now let me move to the potentials of the archives and the source. And first of all, I want to make the point that the full archive in the first place is the biggest repository of information relating to the war in the former Yugoslavia. That's already a very important finding. And for that reason alone, it's incredibly important that it's, as such, it's kept, maintained, and organized. And I was really happy to hear that people in the tribunal and in the MICT are working on that, to do that. And that's crucial. And it's very rich in its diversity, and I think Bob Reed this morning was already very clear in his summary on what the archive constitutes and what kind of material is there. So there's documents from international organizations, from states, from political and military units. There's documents from NGOs, from private citizens, from forensic organizations, notebooks and diaries of the accused, meeting transcripts, witness statements, photographs, films and videos, radio coverage. I can go on and on. But it also includes the trial records, and Elizabeth Emerson yesterday was also talking about it, and what the trial record then includes. And this includes only a portion of what the tribunal has and what it has done, but it includes a lot. So those are the indictments, the briefs, the motions, the decisions, the exhibits, the transcripts, and the judgments, which most of it is publicly available to the larger public, but also to historians. Another important segment, I think, is the material which is produced by the courts, and particular witness testimony. And in the last session, we've been talking about witnesses, but I think that's one of the crucial elements which has been produced by the courts, because they have established a huge repository of oral histories from different perspectives on what has happened during the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia. Now, the potential of the archive is that they're a key to the region's violence. I think they open up a possibility to understand the history of the conflicts and to write a history. So it's not history in itself, but it's a key to the history. But also it can be used in combating denial of undeniable facts. There are many documents in the archives which just show that facts have happened. So if somebody stands up and says, well, this hasn't happened, you have the document there, which I think is very important. It also provides victims, relatives, an opportunity to find out what happened to their loved ones. And I work at the NIOD, which is also an archival institution, on the Second World War, but every day we still have people coming in requesting what had happened to their grandfathers or their grandmothers or even their greater-grandfathers and mothers. So I think it's very important. Also for science, it's important. So social scientific research on mass violence has increased, but I think the trial record and the archive can assist us in understanding the facts, but also the dynamics in which mass violence has taken place. Let me move to the potential of the trial record, that specific part of the archive. I think it's important in several ways. First of all, we can find out how justice was done. It tells us how the proceedings were conducted, who was there, who wasn't there, what questions were asked, what were the dynamics. I think it tells us a lot about really the history of trials, which is also history. It also helps us understand in finding out how facts were established and how judges reached certain conclusions. What was their reasoning in making certain legal findings about historical facts? We also can find out from the trial record what the competing narratives on the past were. And there are many. There are always competing narratives about the past, but the trial record can actually assist us in showing us what those specific competing narratives were. Another potential, and I've mentioned this already, is that we can hear from a range of perspectives from people who were either witnesses, victims, or participants in the mass violence. So we have first-hand stories. Then I'll move to the challenges. And I have not so much time. So the biggest benefit of the trial record of the archive, I think, is also the biggest challenge. So the sheer enormity of the archive is of such a size that it as such becomes almost impossible to study it as a whole. So you actually have to have been there to understand the creation of the records or of the trial records, as Eva has done, for instance. But I think that's a huge challenge. We cannot read the sheer amount of documents. So just for instance, some judgments are already alone 2,500 pages. And I'm happy if I can read a book in a week of 300 pages. So I think it already shows that the huge amount and the size of the archive and the legacy of the tribunal is almost impossible to digest for historians. Now let me move on to some final observations. And I think these are matters which also concern historians, and those are the elements within the public trial records which are either not complete or not available to us. And I think crucial there is the information which was not used during the trial. Yesterday we've heard that only 2 to 3% of the 9 million pages which are in the repository of the OTP are used in the trials. So that means that the rest is unavailable to us and we actually do not know what's in it. But for our historians, I think it's vital to also have access to those documents. And also I think for the people in the region who are actually the owners of those records and of that history. Other elements which concern historians is that some documents, of course, are confidential, they're redacted, and what I think, and this was specifically at the ICTR was the case, is that a lot of trials took place behind closed doors. So in Russia, for instance, 70% of the trials were behind closed doors, so we do not know even what happened in the trials. So having said that, I think it's very important to work towards the disclosure of that archive, and I'm really happy to hear that people are working on it, and also that the people who have been creating that repository are still in the mix to come, because they understand how it came about, how it was found, and what it is. I think that's crucial. And as a last word, and I think that's important to say, is that as historians, we just should be patient as well and wait for the trial records and archives to become available to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thijs. I think you provided us a good overview of the differences between the lawyers and the historians. You showed us on the need to contextualize also the trial record, that we have to read it in conjunction also with other sources, and also how we can best make use of the sources that haven't been revealed, which indeed is a tremendous challenge. And Iva Vukusic has worked with some of the archives and some of the materials as a researcher, so it's a perfect transition to her experience of how these records can be useful for research.
Thank you very much, and thank you once again for to the organizers for inviting me. The benefit of going third is that actually I am able to tick off the things that I wanted to say and just move. Hopefully we're going to have more time for discussion like that. I'm a notoriously fast speaker, so I will read a little bit more than I normally do for the benefit of our lovely translators that have been working very hard for us today. So I will try to focus on 3 main points. One is sort of on the history and law in the context of the ICTY. Much about this has already been said, but I just want to maybe make 2 or 3 points that relate to that. The second is the importance of the ICTY archives and the judicial record, but also the OTP files that we have been hearing about in the last 2 days. And thirdly, maybe the biggest question of all, how history will judge the ICTY. And I think about that question a lot, but yeah, we can maybe talk about that in the Q&A later. So as it was already said, history and law operate on different terms. For courts, it tends to be someone is guilty or innocent, and I think what people talk about, or sort of the stakeholder communities, is that fact. Is someone guilty or innocent, and what the sentence is. As a general rule, the public does not know, sometimes does not understand, and frequently does not care about why the outcome is the way it is. It just reacts to the fact that it is. Few people ever read the judgments. It was previously said. I think Karadzic was 2,615 pages or something like that. I think there's only a number of maniacs outside of the staff that read that kind of stuff. So I think it's absolutely insane to even expect that the people in the street will read it. And I think that comes back to the fact of outreach and what the importance of communicating the work of the tribunals is. We also said sometimes it's boring, although I find it fascinating. Sometimes it's slow. It's all, all of those things that I think we need to understand, that following proceedings for the public, it's like a full-time job. I know because I've done it. So there's no one has the time, if you're not paid for it, to do 5 hours a day in a courtroom. Also, as was said already, history can be more nuanced, is less binary. And it's not confined to narrow concepts such as specific direction. Historians don't care about it. We absolutely have no use for it. But sometimes the things like that are frustrating, where, for example, communicating with the public. Sometimes that's really a challenge. For historians, I would also argue, and for me personally, I'm doing now my PhD and I'm studying ICTY records. Outcome is not necessarily what matters to me. The judgment is not necessarily what matters to me. I follow Stanisic and Simatovic now in the second round religiously, and what I use is what you present in court. What the judges decide, you know, I may personally feel this way or that way, but for the most part, am I doing okay with translation? Am I, yes? Is it okay? I'll really do my best to be slow.
You're a little fast, but it's okay.
I apologize. I'll do my best to be a little bit slower. So outcomes, I think, are not as important as one might think. Also, the similarities, I think, as it was already said before, you know, both are sort of searching for, I would say facts, I wouldn't say truths, because I find truths to be really a very subjective concept. But I mean, this is very philosophical, so we can get into it a little bit later. I think it's also interesting to think about, given that the ICTY is dealing with this adversarial system, that both sides present a quote-unquote, maybe exaggerated is not the right word, but the prosecution presents the least favorable view of a behavior of an individual, and the defense the most favorable view of what is in the record. And I think, again, historians don't have that problem. We can search for the nuances that were already mentioned. And again, it doesn't need to be as black and white as, you know, law, I would say, sometimes is. And again, context is key for history. And the second point, a more practical maybe, is about the use of ICTY records for history. And this may be a little bit practical for some of you that haven't worked on it, and it may be a little bit dull, so I apologize. But for example, for me, it would be a great benefit if the court records database was searchable by ERN numbers, or if I could search TIFF files, because I download big documents and it's impossible for me to search it by word. So things like that, you know, and I'm super happy to provide any sort of, you know, feedback as to how I use these kinds of things. So the ICTY court records database, and I said this and I wrote this before, I cannot compliment the institution enough, and I don't know whose idea this was, to put evidence on the internet. No one else does it, and it's an incredible benefit. So as imperfect as this may be or that may be, the fact that it exists, I'm really grateful as a scholar, but also as a former Yugoslav, because I feel like this is something that was created by the court, but because I'm a former Yugoslav, it's also mine, and I think I should have access to it. So thank you really to the institution, and thank you for asking us how we use it and what we would like. As said already before, the ICTY court database, court record database, it's not for citizens. I worked with history teachers trying to tell them how to use it, and it's overwhelming. And I get it. You're a court. You're not an educational institution. It's, you know, it's fine. But we need to find ways to use what you have. And here I would absolutely compliment, for example, Sense News Agency and the special projects that they have done on Operation Storm, Srebrenica, and destruction of cultural heritage. That are, I think, really the way. I don't know if anyone from Sense is here, but that's the way, I think, to do it for the public, to present kind of, this is what the prosecution said, this is what the defense said, make it readable, make it understandable. I think that's absolutely a fantastic contribution, not to mention also other coverage that I think is really important in sort of transmitting some of these narratives. So Balkan Insight, BIRN, IWPR, Humanitarian Law Fund, Documenta, you know, all of these, and I hope I'm not forgetting someone, but I would really say that this is incredibly important. Maybe no one ever intended for this to be the largest, most significant depository of the tragedy and the horror that happened to us, but kind of almost as an afterthought, to me, it almost became like the most important thing that the ICTY has done. because people go to prison and then they come out and, you know, but this historical record is something that would have never happened hadn't it been for these trials. I'm Croatian, I come from Zagreb, and I'm absolutely sure that my government and other governments would not collect and share this stuff if it hadn't been admitted into these proceedings. So I think that's really an accomplishment that I cannot praise enough. I said something about the searchability. The goal, and this is interesting because, and I think slowly I'll come to an end. I think the goal is not, and I wrote my master's thesis about sort of a shared history. That was 10 years ago, I dumped that idea. Now I think it only needs to be a fact-based, because if you look at the US Civil War, there's no, what shared history? There are debates that go on to this day, and I think in society, I mean, sometimes it makes your stomach turn, but I get, you know, I understand that we don't necessarily have to have the exact same perception of what happened, but we have to respect the fact that, you know, there are some basic facts that should be sort of a shared thing that we start from. And finally, how history will judge the ICTY. I would say it really depends whom you ask. Also, it depends on which day you ask. When some stuff comes out, I really love it much less. But you know, this is the life of any institution, so I think it's quite natural. But when you talk about the public, which public? When you talk about perceptions of this and this group, groups are not monolithic. I know as a Croatian person, I go against the grain very often on what is, and Mario, I'm sorry, does as well. So there are, you know, even in our, I think sometimes it's simplified how this or that group feel about that. Again, coming back to the expectations, it sort of depends what we expected from it, I guess, in the first place. And I just want to sort of finish to say that these records can and should be used in national proceedings by our own institutions. And I really hope what we've heard in the last couple of days, that there's going to be a concerted effort to continue and make better those trials, I would say, for the benefit of all of us. Others can build on this experience in terms of prosecutions, but also the collection and sharing of evidence in places like Syria, for example, for the future. And we can really try to use this material to figure out what happened to us and why, without hate, without prejudice, without judgment, and not necessarily with a desire to blame, but with a desire to understand and to accept. So on that note, I will end, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Eva, I think, for a fascinating presentation, really bringing it down to the practicalities and at the same time challenging some of our conventional wisdoms by saying that outcome might be matter less than actually the process leading to it, and also challenging the view that obviously our perception of groups can be monolithic, and that we have to transcend these boundaries in order to get a clearer picture. The last presentation will be given by Andy Iredon-Atchison, who will relate it a little bit more then to different categories of evidence and their use as historical record. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Karsten. Thank you very much to the organisers for making this dialogue possible, and I hope that this is part of an ongoing series of dialogues, particularly in this area about the contribution of the tribunal to history. Of course, thank you to you as an audience for not taking the opportunity at the end of a Friday to run off and enjoy the beautiful countryside and clean air that is only a matter of minutes away when you're in Sarajevo. I want to talk through today, so as we've been going through the panel, I guess we've been kind of narrowing from some of the broad considerations to some of the more practical questions as well about how we use this material. So I want to take you through a couple of examples of criminological research, one of my own and one by a colleague who works just a few doors down at the Faculty for Criminalistics and Criminology here in Sarajevo. There is a full paper, and I'm happy to make that available to anyone after the session if you approach me or look me up. And I have to thank the panel as well for inviting me along, because this is a panel about a contribution to history, and I am a criminologist. So I stick out a little bit here, but I'm a criminologist who at the moment is using material that fits into contemporary history. So I think hopefully we can have a useful dialogue, and I'll say a couple of things about that right at the end of the paper. So the way that I want to deal with this is to go through some ideas about the juridical byproducts, but I'll kind of do that light touch because I think those themes have been touched on in detail already. And then locate criminology in relation to this, and particularly in relation to atrocity crimes. And I nod to David Schaefer over there for bringing together a number of crimes under this very useful label, which has caught on in criminology these days. I'll then speak through the two examples before I come to a couple of points about, well, what happens next? Where do we go from here? So the first thing to say that the use of testimony as some kind of data by historians or by social scientists certainly isn't new. There's material out there that utilizes, for example, the Turkish military tribunals that took place in the wake of the First World War. So we're not dealing with something that hasn't been dealt with before. I do, and I think Karsten highlighted this in his product, I do treat what comes out of the court in terms of the archive very much as a byproduct. I'm quite happy to leave judges to judge and prosecutors to prosecute, but to accept what comes down from that process. But it does mean, of course, that we need to have a certain understanding of their orientations compared to our own, and I think the other panelists have touched on that quite well. But there are kind of a number of practical things that come out of this for social scientists. To some extent, these are common with any social science that's utilizing secondary data, and in some cases they are specific to the work of the tribunal or the judicial environment. So particularly, we've already touched on the fact that we don't have access to all the material. Processes of redaction means that there are things that at the moment we simply can't see. But more importantly, there are other things that we can't see, and that's what I'm terming backstage activity here. So before a witness actually comes into the court and gives their testimony, a lot of stages will have happened. There will have been initial investigation interviews, the callback, there may be some working through with that witness to help them deliver their testimony in a way that is useful to the parties in the courtroom so that they get the most out of it. We don't see that. So what we see is this byproduct, this end product. And what comes into the courtroom, of course, particularly in an adversarial system, is subject to partisanship and control. The judges have control over what is deemed to be admissible. The parties, the defense, the prosecution themselves, choose what they're going to put forward as well. Then it comes down to the individual witnesses as well. And we've already been introduced to the idea of human fallibility. People may be prone to forget, to misremember, to misrepresent because of how it affects their own self-interest, their own self-image. And this isn't necessarily criticizing people for that. Sometimes people will be downright mendacious. But there are lots of other forms of human fallibility that will affect the evidence that is brought forward. Nonetheless, I think as Thijs has indicated, the documentary richness of the ICTY compared to some other ad hoc tribunals or courts, in a sense gives us a best case scenario that if we're going to use a court's byproducts, then this might be one of the best courts to be looking at. So I want to come briefly to what's a criminologist doing here. Criminology has been relatively late to come to the theme of atrocity crimes and the problem of atrocity crimes, which is a bit puzzling when you've got the science of crime and often dealing with the crime of crimes. And it was only really in the late 1990s that sustained criminological attention started to build up. These days, there's a special working group in the European Society of Criminology specifically looking at atrocity crime. And there's a growing body of work. But it has been something that is only really a feature of the last 15 years, I would say, effectively. But criminology is very much about an orientation towards crime and how it is conceptualized, a descriptive endeavor which provides the empirical foundation for much of what we assert, explanations about patterns of crime, distribution of crime, processes of crime, and the social responses to crime. So from all of that, I think there are various things that criminologists can take from the records produced by the tribunal. But while there's a growing body of work in criminology dealing with this and using the records of the ad hoc tribunals, it very rarely concentrates on the methodological implications. It certainly isn't making it explicit. And I think that's one of the things that we as criminologists should be now trying to do. For example, one of the authors up there, Mullins, working with judgments in the ICTR, says that it gives us thick description of what happened. I would take issue with that. I think the judgment itself is there oriented towards a particular purpose, and we need to go a little bit deeper if we're to get thick description, a multi-dimensional understanding of what's been happening. And so I come now to my first example, a work which I think makes a great contribution both to conceptual discussions around what genocide means, but also to our knowledge of the particular case of what happened here in Bosnia, more specifically in 7 municipalities in the east of the country. So Edina Bećirović is proposing a key argument which says that international jurisprudence has misrecognized when and where genocide took place in Bosnia. And she would widen the framework in which we understand that. And she uses the sources of the ICTY and other sources to revisit those findings. Now, her way in here, and this is something, again, where I would differ, is to start with the judgment, mainly with the judgment, sometimes with the indictment, as her way into this. And in her book, which I would recommend to all of you, you will find the bulk of her empirical content in chapter 4. And I'm a bit of a geek. I'm glad that certain footnotes get to be famous in history, because I've been going through and counting and analyzing people's footnotes, including my own. So there are 315 footnotes in that chapter, and I've been digging around to see exactly what they draw on and what they do. So there are a number of them that provide her empirical basis, and of those, about 110 relate directly to material from the tribunal. And if you don't believe me about counting, there's some of the evidence. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this just shows that there are multiple phases of the process that form data points for Edina's work. Indictment, testimony, judgment itself. And I've even investigated where they relate to, and this is actually quite useful to understand one of the issues with archives. Archives are never complete records. There are gaps in archives. So what you see behind me at the moment is a summary of the municipalities she looks at and how much evidence she's able to draw from the ICTY for each of those. So you can see that 79% of her citations of evidence for Foča come from the tribunal. When you come down to Rogatica, it's only one piece of evidence that she draws, only 5% of the complete body of evidence that she is drawing on. So continuing to be an obsessive counter, this sent me back to the actual indictments. So this is a bit rough and ready. There may be some flexibility on this. But what you see behind me here are the number of cases that in the indictments mention specific municipalities. So there are a number of municipalities that feature heavily in indictments. There are a number that only appear once, twice. There are some municipalities that don't appear whatsoever, and there will be good reasons for that in many cases. But those gaps are often in areas that will still be criminologically interesting. I can think, for example, of Bihać. It's often referred to as Bosnia's forgotten battlefield. The fact that we don't have those sources is quite important, because it means that we have to look for other ways to find out about it. But even where there are places where no particular atrocity crime took place, that in itself is criminologically interesting. Criminologists can be as interested in why people conform, don't deviate, obey the law, as they can be in why people commit crimes. So just finally on Edina's work, narrowing in on the municipality of Visegrad, I've listed the main sources that she uses there. I'm conscious that someone from the faculty is taking photos of this, so this is all going straight back to Edina at some point. What you see here is a wide range of sources. From the court, she draws primarily on the Vasiljevich judgment and the indictment in the Lukic and Lukic case. Using this, she critiques the judgments to say that what they don't do is capture the pervasive atmosphere of killing and death that was ongoing in Visegrad in 1992. And to some extent, I think that's understandable. We've already heard about the particular tasks of judges, that they are looking at specific incidents put before them by the prosecutors to determine innocence or guilt. But actually, I think if you use the judgment carefully as a guide to direct you back to the testimony, and the judges are citing very particular parts of testimony, then you do find that atmosphere. You find testimony about the bodies floating down in the river. You find testimony about blood on the bridge. You find testimony about mass graves. And you find testimony about mutilated corpses. So all of that is there, but it does take a bit more digging. Now, towards the end of that chapter, Edina does something particularly useful from a social scientific perspective. She goes beyond the tribunal. She does a number of interviews, and she looks at published sources as well. What this allows her to do is to make a wider point about denial of crimes and denial of genocide in Visegrad itself. But this, I think, is where what she's doing is a social scientific task and doesn't really allow us to criticize the particular judgment. She's drawing on a social scientific concept of genocide that involves multiple stages, including one of denial. But that's an expansion beyond the original legal concept of genocide, and so perhaps it's a bit much to ask for that to be integrated into the work of the tribunal. So a few interim conclusions from that. I think it shows that there is real potential in the output of the ICTY. I think we can take this very, very seriously. But by stopping short of using the examples of direct testimony that are there, I think it misses something. It certainly shows, however, the added value, and this is her conceptual contribution and her contribution to knowledge about the case, of further social scientific methods beyond the archival research. So I come to my own work now, and I'm interested in the role of police in atrocity crimes. And I could go into why I think this is a criminologically important question, but I think that's not the main point here. But this is very much about using the archives to answer questions at an institutional level. And unlike Edina, my entry point is the transcripts. So I go straight to the transcripts and the exhibits, bypassing the judgment, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. Just for context, this is a case study. I count this as being a very, very long pilot study. I'm hoping to develop something much more comparative, dealing with internal security forces across the former Yugoslavia, wherever there are conflicts and we have evidence from the court. But this focuses specifically on Republika Srpska and on the Autonomous Republic of Krajina. And much of the evidence, in particular, comes from these 4 municipalities shaded in blue here. And I think it's no coincidence that in 3 of them, there is a very, very fine balance between the ethnic groups. And in the other, you have the main kind of urban center for that area. We've heard about how much material people are dealing with. I narrowed in on 2 cases. Now, obviously, the cases I can narrow in on is determined by the tribunal. I can't look at material that hasn't been heard. But within that, I've selected 2 cases that cut across the Republika Srpska and the regional and the municipal level, and that allow me to look at political leaders and police leaders as well. So you see that in looking at this material, I have plowed through about 52,000 pages of transcripts. And this is one of the things about going in through the transcripts rather than the judgments. It's much less efficient. There were over 3,000 pieces of evidence called in Berjanen. I'm going to swiftly skip over that, but just to let you know, I needed help to do this, and help came in the form of qualitative software, which helped me reduce this down to 56 witnesses that I knew who they were, further anonymous witnesses. And I count my own footnotes as well. So the empirical foundation is there to be seen. Less important is the substance of the paper. It allowed me to describe police violence in the region, and it allowed me to come up with an explanation for how that comes about, how the police organization changes through processes of democratization, polarization, politicization, deprofessionalization, and militarization. Now, there are problems in this, and I think I could say a little bit more in the questions and answers about what I would do now, were I doing this study again, and what will I take forward into future studies. But I will skip that just to say one last point, I think, which is the first 3 points there are about my personal research desires, my personal agenda, what I want to do. The last point is I think there's an opportunity to build partnerships which are interdisciplinary, which will help build research capacity in institutions across the world, which might help build internships in the archives, but that can also bring together people that can help social scientists like myself understand some of the background, some of the processes that are taking place that shapes what we look at as data. So judges, prosecutors, archivists, defense counsels, all of those people can help us understand what we're looking at. And so to me, one recommendation would be multidisciplinary research teams trying to pull in some support to do that. And the other would be about academic outreach. We've already heard about how we speak in a different language, which might be more accessible. Actually, academics and accessible language don't always go together, but I would say that we should look at how our products can be adapted to reach that wider audience that I think we all see as being highly relevant. And with that, I'll thank you for your indulgence, and I will close.
Thank you so much, Andy. I think your last point on multidisciplinarity is absolutely key. I think we can only understand legacies through the lens of different disciplines. And I think your point that criminology has an important voice in this debate and came out only late is actually very, very important. As a lawyer, of course, you're very interested to hear that footnotes actually matter. So thank you very much for this. So we still have some time for Q&A. So I would invite questions and comments. Mark Drombold.
Hey, thanks. That was a fantastic panel. Really, really interesting. So I have a broader question about the role of historians and the profession of history. And that is this. One sad reality is that in the world of atrocities, only a very small number of atrocities ever become judicialized, in particular internationally. So with that as a premise, I would like to leverage that premise into a question about the role of the historian. Because if the role of the historian becomes one to chase the trials, in particular international trials, and turn to the information generated by international trials as data sources, archives, reservoirs of information, fonts of facts, and so forth, then one thing that I worry about is that once again, those places whose violence becomes judicialized now not only are places that become colonized by lawyers, but now also by historians. And I worry about all the places whose atrocities never become judicialized. Does that leave them even further in the dark, so to speak? And then in turn, if historians and histories become connected to trials and judicialization, does that not also have a distortive effect on the overall big picture, the overall meta-narratives, the overall, I don't know, the overall trajectory of violence and the human condition? So that's just my little question. Thanks. There you go.
Thank you. I would suggest we collect a few questions so that we can allow a pencil to answer collectively. Next to Mark.
I'm sorry, we had one question here before that, I think. No?
Hi.
Yep.
So my question...
Can you stand up?
Sure. My question would like to ask you to explore a little bit, since a number of the panelists said they like to go beyond the judgments and look more to the transcript and the trial records. I would like you to speak to, if you could speak a little bit to the issue of plea bargaining, since once a plea bargain takes place, much of that transcript is not available. And what we really have is just the, at best, maybe a personal statement or a statement of admission from the defendant, and that becomes the entire basis from which the judgment is then constructed. So I'm curious, as historians, whether you have a particular perception about the use of plea bargains, particularly at the ICTY, which is connected to a national jurisdiction in which this practice is quite unfamiliar.
Thank you. I think that it's an excellent question. Let's collect a few more questions. Yes.
Sorry, we had one question
Okay.
first. Yeah. My apologies. I feel it's incumbent on me to ask the gender question, which is twofold. First, we know there is a disproportionate difference between the number of men and women testifying. So our transcripts are already giving a certain gendered narrative here. That's the first issue. And the second issue is we're talking redaction, and that is clearly most visible in relation to insider witnesses, of course, but also clearly sexual violence witnesses. So we have two significant gendered shapings of this public legal archive.
Thank you. I had another intervention here.
My question relates a little bit to the nature of international criminal law, which I find very difficult to explain or to understand. Now already law is very difficult to understand, but I feel like international criminal law for non-lawyers is even more difficult to understand. I think this touches upon a little bit what Andy mentioned. For instance, if you look at genocide, the definition that a layperson would have of genocide is extremely different from the definition, from the legal international criminal law definition. The legal definition is in that sense maybe overly narrow. Then when you look at modes of liability, such as joint criminal enterprise, that is maybe overly inclusive for a layperson to understand. And just by finishing to correct exams of my students last night, I realized that even for students who are about to graduate, it's extremely difficult to understand these kinds of concepts. And I was wondering, whose task is it to communicate this paradox? And I know that obviously lawyers, and I think especially judges, are conservative people, and I think that it's in a way good that we say a tribunal such as the ICTY shouldn't have as a primary task to communicate some kind of historical truth or truth or facts or whatever. But I feel like we're still confronted with this difficulty, and I refuse to say, yeah, we need better outreach. We need better outreach because we heard yesterday from Marco that better outreach won't even help. So is there any way that we could rethink international criminal tribunals, given that they are all the time misunderstood?
Thank you for this wonderful question. So I would suggest we give our panelists a chance to answer, and I would first ask Professor Harman van der Velde.
I will address the first part of the question which posed by Mark and the last question, because it's quite interesting to see. Well, if I understand you correctly, you say, well, if the historians take stock of what the judiciary said, doesn't it imply that a number of conflicts will be neglected because they do not address this? Well, I think that it would be an incentive for the judiciary, of course, to take more. But that is, of course, a rather sophisticated answer. I understand that. But it is interesting to see the differences in approach between judges now and then. I had a wonderful opportunity at a Viva where there were in the commission one judge from the ICY and one from the ICC. And I just, for the sake of argument, I raised this issue of history in the courtroom. Now, the interesting point was that the judge from the ICTY was much more interested, and it stands to reason. You can understand it. Why? Because they can concentrate and focus on one and specific conflict, while the ICC, of course, has the entire world in principle as its playground. Yes, so that is far more difficult. On the other hand, if you have a proper judgment, be it from a domestic judiciary or from an international criminal court, it can be interesting material for historians to work on. So that is perhaps part of an answer to your question, I think. And the final question about, well, you need a very good PR person in order to translate the idea. But should international criminal tribunals change their language for that purpose? I don't think so. I simply think that they can't, because it serves a useful purpose. And perhaps that was something we tried to convey. And we should try to find a fit between historians who can take up this language. You're quite right in saying that, of course, genocide in the public memory is different from genocide as a legal concept, and JCE may be over-inclusive. I think it can be for a historian trained in law, it can be a very interesting challenge to communicate what is exactly meant by this. I think that is a very interesting challenge.
Thank you so much, Harman. I think Mark Dromble's question went I think, a dimension further, asking us whether the focus that we have judicial institutions in some areas and that get portrayed, it comes with certain inclusions and exclusions, and do we have to be more wary of this? I think so. It's a little bit a more radical question that he asked, and I think I'm looking to Thijs whether he might be able to provide a perspective on this.
Thanks, Mark, for very good question. I think there are many dimensions to this. So I think there is an option for historians to use trial records to be even better informed about a certain perspective, which can be the judicial's perspective, but also the sources produced, like witness testimonies, etc., etc. So I think Christopher Browning, in his 92 study, is one of the first to do that, and he was using the trial sources to understand why white people were doing certain things. So I think, in that respect, I think it's a good thing. I think also, by studying some trials, we actually become aware of some conflicts which were forgotten. And we don't know so much about the trials in Ethiopia, for instance, but they had their own war crimes tribunal, which dealt with 5,000 suspects, including genocide crimes. And even the former president was convicted to a life sentence, in absentia, though. But actually, through this trial, we know much more about the history of the Derg regime in the 1970s in Ethiopia and the violence which took place there. And I think the same counts for the extraordinary African chambers. So quite recently there was a judgment of Hissène Habré, which sheds a light or his perspective into the forgotten conflict in Chad in the 1980s. So I think in that respect it is important and it's useful to use the trial or the trials as a first lens on history and forgotten conflicts. On the other hand, I think historians have dealt with so many forgotten conflicts in so many books that we were not even able to read them, even in many languages. So I think many conflicts have not per se been forgotten. What I think is interesting, and you see this much more, is that historians are using legal language for really far away or distant, I would say, crimes. For instance, couple of years, I think 2 years ago, Benjamin Madley wrote a book on the genocide in the United States of America in the 19th century, applying the Genocide Convention to a historical case. And I think that's also interesting in that respect, is that historians pick up the legal language. So I think that's also another dimension, and perhaps it's in that way adding to the colonization of the narrative, as you would say so. So I hope to to have answered your question a little bit. And I want to say one thing about the plea bargaining, which I also found a very interesting question. And I only know one example, and this took place at the ICTR. In the case of Jean Kambanda, who was the prime minister of the genocide regime, and he went actually into a plea bargaining, and there is a plea agreement. And basically what happened is that he signed off a document which told a very specific historical narrative of what had happened, which is interesting because he just agreed to it. But of course it wasn't tested in a trial. There were no witnesses called, etc., etc. And at the moment he received a life sentence. Of course he refused that specific narrative to which he had signed. So I think that's also interesting and important to know, is that the defendants themselves are very pragmatic in what they would admit to, and when to admit to, and for what reasons, and then how we use that later on as a piece of historical writing. And I think it's used much in the judgments, so they would cite Kambanda, but historians don't use it so much for the reason I was just explaining. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Thijs. Eva, you will have some perspective to it.
Thank you. I will try to integrate 2 or 3 questions that were posed that I feel I'm best qualified and best placed to reply. First of all, I would do the geeky thing and recommend the book of Vladimir Petrovic about use of historical expertise in court. It's out last year by Routledge, and it's called Cleo Takes the Stand. And it's a really good study of sort of the historical development of using history in court. Secondly, I have to say this, otherwise I will not be able to sleep tonight. There's been a focus on genocide, and I think it's a legitimate thing to argue about a legal definition, as long as we accept that this and this number of people were killed in this and this way, in this and this place. Because I think it's a legitimate thing to say without being accused of being a denier. As Marko Milanovic said, and you've been quoted already, these people are no less dead if they're victims of crimes against humanity as opposed to the crime of genocide. Am I quoting you correctly, Marko? Are you approving? But I really feel that's an important thing to say. That crime against humanity is also awful, and it's no less, I would say. Further, in relation to the things that are or are not subject to judicial proceedings, for example, I'm looking at paramilitaries, the state organized crime, and kind of the idea of plausible deniability. For me, for example, if I want to study that in the context of Serbia and the former Yugoslavia, there's no other place for me as a Croatian woman that lives in The Hague and used to work for the Sarajevo prosecutor's office. There's no other place for me to go because I don't have access, and I will probably not have access to the people that know stuff about this. So I think, and I will contribute in some way, and then people that have some other kind of access will contribute in another way. And I think that's very much sort of the trade of history. So I understand your point. I absolutely endorse it. And I think, for example, in places like Syria, where the judicial response has been frustratingly inadequate, there's documentation done on an unprecedented scale. It's not the court, but there's tons of stuff being collected and verified and documented. And this is a place for historians to go one day. So yeah, finally, I just want to end with the importance of insider testimony. And maybe we haven't spoken about that enough, but I feel like for me, that's something that is really incredibly important in figuring out how certain structures work and how certain processes took place. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Eva. Andy.
Okay, a few comments starting with the role of the historian. I mean, I think Donald Bloxham a colleague who's a proper historian at Edinburgh, has noted the impact of trials on our historical knowledge and how the enduring image of the Holocaust is the death camp coming out of the Nuremberg tribunals, but how historians have had to work quite hard to get a lot of other things taken into that. But I think what I would say in terms of using the records, it helps us identify some of those gaps. But also I would say there's an ethical issue here which I didn't touch on in the paper, and that is to say we've already, particularly in the last session, been thinking about issues of re-traumatizing people. And you see that as people break down and if you go through the testimony of the tribunal. And so I think before we, as researchers, go back to those people, I think we need to think very carefully about what do we need to do first, what can we do that doesn't mean going back to them. In terms of those gaps, I think the gender gap is a really important one, and so that is one of the things that can be identified by knowing the archive. You can speak about this. But also the archive has been used usefully to challenge some judicial narratives about gender already. Professor Buss has gone back from judgments on Srebrenica to the testimony to show how the judges often sideline the agency of women from Srebrenica and present them in a way that is not consistent with the actual live testimony that has been heard. So I think there are still things that we can do. And again, this is one of the reasons that I think it is always very important to dig deeper, to go back beyond the judgments as well, and that can challenge some of the narratives that skew our impression of the gendering of society and the gendering of victimization. With plea bargaining, I would say, as a social scientist, that's a judicial question. I'm not touching it. I've said I want to let the judges judge, the prosecutors prosecute. And so I think that the one thing that they perhaps shouldn't be taking into account is the archival question there. I wouldn't want to interfere. There are lots of arguments about why plea bargaining is right or wrong. That's not a position that I would put myself into. And then finally, who communicates all this stuff and how? Just to go back to, I think, one of the last points that I made, before I came here on Monday and Tuesday, I was at a residential event with PhD criminologists from across Scotland. And one of the key sessions was everyone getting together to be anxious about how we as academics communicate with diverse audiences. So it's not just a challenge for the court, it's a challenge for academics. And we need to start thinking about this in innovative ways and thinking, who do we need to convince of the merits of the narratives that we're building, or who do we need to engage with to make those narratives better? And we can be creative about this. One of my favourite colleagues at Edinburgh has actually used the Scottish Storytelling Centre in order to work out how best to communicate with civil servants. There's long been a myth that civil servants like hard numbers. Actually, they don't. They like live stories as well. So I think what we can do is think, so I mentioned kind of interdisciplinary teams, add a storyteller to that team, add a graphic novelist to that team. There are lots of ways in which we can communicate the knowledge that we are collectively building as a group of researchers.
Thank you so much, Andy. We have one last request, which we cannot deny. The President wants to speak.
Or it's not, and there will be consequences otherwise. Just a very brief remark on the issue of plea bargaining. This wasn't the practice in the beginning of the tribunal's life. I don't know if Judge Schomburg is still here or not. I think he's left. But there was a guy called Dragan Nikolic, who was the first indictee of the tribunal. Soon after I arrived, probably it would have been 2004, 2 or 3 years after his trial came up. And there were negotiations between him and the Office of the Prosecutor. And he chose to enter a guilty plea. The trial chamber was composed of Judge Schomburg, myself, and Judge Mumba. And we had a meeting. I'm not going to reveal anything confidential because the outcome of this meeting became the practice that we adopted and which was followed later on. And the whole argument was the following. I wasn't happy that you would get someone who struck a deal with the prosecutor, who would make a statement which would be now entered as the basis. This is a statement on facts, which the person entering the plea is admitting, not just the guilt, but also these facts. We were faced with a situation where the facts that were pleaded were not all the facts that had appeared or which formed part of the indictment to start with. The second, and which was the most irritating thing, was that this way you had about, if I remember well, over 100 witnesses in that case, many of whom had suffered the most atrocious torture. There were killings, there was everything. And by simply accepting the guilty plea, we were going to deprive all these witnesses of the great opportunity they all seek, namely to be given the opportunity to come to the tribunal and tell their story. So there was no sense in bringing them all to the Hague and tell their story when you had the guilty plea. So what we did was, for the first time, we decided that we would make a selection based on what we knew of those who would have been key witnesses, and bring them over and give them the opportunity to testify and say what they wanted to say in regard to what they had gone through, in regard to the role played by the accused pleading guilty, and it worked. It was an experiment that it worked. We also, on that occasion, did not accept the statement of fact that had been presented by, and in fact, another one was drawn up, which was more acceptable. And we also made it clear to the prosecution that we were not even interested in knowing if they had come to an agreement with the accused as regards the sentence that would be acceptable for the prosecution. So that's your business, we are not interested. I hope you do not, we hope you do not put us into that predicament. And in fact, the end result was the prosecution didn't. The prosecution, however, did recommend a maximum, and which we exceeded. In other words, the prosecutor, I can't remember now the details, but we gave a couple of more years than the prosecution had asked for. We gave 23 years, if I remember well, and then they were reduced by about 6 months by the appeals chamber. But that was a practice that we introduced and which was followed in a few other occasions, because don't forget that there were some very important witnesses that had taken part, one in the planning of the Srebrenica events, the other one in the execution of about over 1,000 individuals in a matter of a couple of hours. And these not only made statements, but the procedure was followed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. And this is to some extent reflected in the ICC statute in Article 65. There's a possibility of the trial chamber, even if there's a admission of guilt, to enter into further gathering of evidence and to hear victims. So I think maybe the lesson of Nikolic is partly taken into account in this new framework. It's a very important lesson. So I think we've heard a fantastic panel which really went, I think, beyond some of the classical divides that we had on law and history. Please give a big round of applause to our panelists. We went a bit over time, but I hope that it was worth to you. So we hope we can formulate also some recommendations for the final conclusions of this conference. With this, I adjourn this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. May I remind you that next and immediately after the panel, we will now screen the latest documentary produced by the ICTY outreach program, Never Justified, about the crimes of torture prosecuted before the ICTY. The screening is in BCS, but we have the interpretation to English, so please stay in your seats. We will start the screening immediately. Thank you very much.